you, Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters. Now, I'm going to break Toastmasters protocol, and I'm going to talk about politics tonight. And I'm also going to break my own personal protocol, and I'm going to elicit audience participation. You all like audience participation, right? Raise your hand if you like audience participation. It's a little meta audience participation joke. Okay, politics. Raise your hand, and I want you to be honest if you consider yourself to be a liberal. Raise your hand if you consider yourself to be a conservative. And raise your hand if you think you fall somewhere in the middle. Well, you're all wrong. Because according to the traditional definition of liberalism, we're all liberals, I think. The traditional definition being a political belief that holds that it's the proper function of government to secure the freedom and equal rights of its citizens. So we all agree that freedom and equal rights are a good thing, right? We all think that it's the proper function of government to secure freedom and equal rights for its citizens. Raise your hand if you think that's a good thing. Okay, well, you're wrong. because it's impossible. That's simply not what governments do. Think of it this way. Two prime functions of any competent government are to preserve law and order and to settle disputes. Well, if you want to preserve law and order, a government necessarily has to restrict freedom. And if a government wants to settle disputes, it necessarily has to discriminate between one party and another. So it's impossible for a government that wants to maintain law and order and settle disputes to also secure freedom and equal rights for its citizens. Let's look at some specific examples. Freedom of speech. We all believe that we have the freedom of speech in this country. But in fact, it's limited. We all know the example that I can't run into a movie theater and scream fire and incite a panic. I don't know why anyone would want to do that, but apparently that's a limitation on our freedom of speech. I also can't use my speech to incite violence. And also political speech, which is the most protected form of speech under our legal system, is also highly limited. If I wanted to protest at a political rally, I would have to stand in a specific location. In some cases, I would have to apply for a permit. So speech is limited. It's not free. Let's talk about freedom of religion. We believe that in this country we have the freedom to practice our religions as we see fit, but in fact it is limited. I cannot practice a religion that requires me to perform an unlawful act, for example. I cannot practice a religion that requires me to be intolerant of other people's practices of religion. So before I can freely practice my religion, I have to buy into those two concepts. And not every religion in the world wants to be tolerant of other religions. So if you notice, my freedom will necessarily bump up against your freedom. So it's impossible for a government to secure the freedom of all its citizens. It has to be limited. Let's talk about equal rights. Specifically, let's talk about the non-controversial subject of school segregation. Thank you for that. I diffused the tension somehow. So in 1954, the Supreme Court decided in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education that it's unconstitutional for public schools to be segregated. Now, on the surface, that appears to be a decision that promotes equality. Actually, it's a decision that's highly discriminatory. It's discriminating against those people who wanted to maintain a segregated school system, and it's discriminating in favor of those people who want to desegregate schools. And it doesn't matter what side of the debate you fall on. I mean, I assume everyone in here would say they're in favor of desegregation. But you cannot deny that one group of people was discriminated against and another group of people was discriminated in favor of. And that's every decision or action a government takes. It necessarily, when it acts, will discriminate in favor of one group and against another group. Even if a government takes no action or makes no decision on a specific topic, it's necessarily discriminating against those people who are discriminating in favor of those people who want to maintain the status quo, and against those people who are seeking change. So the purpose of this speech project is to discuss an abstract concept. I chose liberalism. And I'm certainly not arguing against equality and freedom and equal rights. I think those are fine things. But I do want to point out that there's a certain incoherence to them when applied as priorities for a government to orient themselves around. And maybe it's impossible for any political philosophy to overlay perfectly onto reality. I don't know. But when we founded this country, our founders had the idea that they wanted to create a society where people could live freely and equally together. And I think all things considered, they did a pretty good job of it, especially considering the fact that it's impossible.